Of the great city of Detroit. We giggle a little bit when you say that. This is a picture of Detroit from the Detroit River. And Detroit is one of those places where it has become, it used to be like one of the crowning cities of the world. You know, the center of the automobile industry, Motown. Has become in many ways a little bit of a punchline. Now I have kind of an embarrassed pride because I love the city of Detroit. It's my hometown, but my hometown is Detroit, which is what it is. A lot of people know Detroit from headlines like this: Detroit takes a plunge. The first major metropolitan city in the United States to declare bankruptcy. And when I was a kid, Detroit wasn't great when I was a kid. It's not like I grew up in Emerald City and then it slowly declined. It was in decline even when I was a kid. But there was a time before that where it was this vibrant city and then strong. And then over time, for a variety of reasons, the city slowly began to kind of fall to pieces. If you were to go to Detroit today and drive through the neighborhoods, they would look a lot like this. Detroit was a city that was built for about 3 million people. And today there's less than 1 million that actually live inside the city of Detroit. And you think about that just from a management standpoint. You have this massive city, I don't know how many square miles, many, many homes built and designed for 3 million plus people, and now there's 850,000 people that live there, leaving behind an exceptional amount of empty space to try to manage with a city that doesn't function very well, a city that is run out of money, a city whose population for a majority live at or below the poverty level, and the city has been in a steady decline and decay and has recently filed for bankruptcy. Now, this hits a little bit deeper for me personally because as the city goes into bankruptcy, they have all this money that they owe to people. They got to figure out, you know, are we going to pay these people back? And there's creditors that want their money. And one of the places that they're seeking to cut money is in pensions for retired city workers. Both of my parents are retired Detroit police officers. My dad spent 25 years working as a Detroit police officer. My mom almost 20 years as a Detroit police officer. And through all that time investing in this city pension fund, this Detroit Police and Fire Department pension funds, with an eye for the future, that they're going to retire and that money will be there for them. And now my dad turns 69 today. I may call my dad today. Turns 69 years old today, and he's a worried man. He's looking at that going, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen with this money. They haven't made any decisions about what's going to happen with this money, where they're going to make these cuts. But my dad is looking at some pretty significant changes potentially, which is probably a very scary place to be if you're a 70-year-old man. And you think about that, he spent his time looking towards the future, investing and planning, thinking that there were people there taking care of his money, that he's putting away and planning for retirement with his pension and all this stuff. And my mom the same thing, and now here he is 70 years old and he's still working full time. Now some of it is because he just likes to work, but some of it is also maybe going, I'm going to need this money because I don't know what's going to happen with the future. And so, you know, Detroit is this amazing example of, you know, what's down the road for folks. We can make a lot of plans and we can do everything that we can try to do in an attempt to try to plan out what the future is going to hold, but you never really know. There's no guarantees. We talked last week about the idea of suffering, and that, you know, Christianity, a Christian worldview, doesn't just dismiss suffering. It does some good things with it. It gives it a reason for existence. It gives it purpose, but then it also gives it hope. And that's kind of trailing on that hope part is kind of where we're going to be at today. Talking about this idea of making sense of the future. We talked last week about this idea that most human beings operate under the idea of trying to avoid pain as much as possible. In many, many different ways. You know, we try to be healthy, take care of our bodies so that they're going to last a little bit longer down the road. We invest a lot of money in science and technology and medicine in an attempt to try to fight off diseases that may come our way, and all of those things, I'm not saying are necessarily bad things, but that's kind of how we operate. We operate with this idea that we want to try to prevent as much suffering as we possibly can. And we discover, as we talked about it last week, is that we can't necessarily do that very well because things continue to seem to pop up. And so we came to the conclusion last week that what a Christian worldview is take this pain and suffering, and it doesn't just tell us why it's there, it doesn't just tell us why it can be a benefit, but it can also give us a solution. And that's where our emphasis is going to be as we begin to talk about the solution of pain. Last week, we talked about a boy and his goldfish. And this week, we're going to go a little bit farther along that road. Because as we talk about the future, there's a lot of this apologetic stuff. We can spend a lot of time with a lot of different topics and go on and on and on. But for us, if we're going to talk about making sense of the future, let's go to the farthest end of that future and deal specifically with something that is very difficult for us to talk about. One that we don't go into lightly or foolishly, but the reality of what happens at the very end. If we're going to talk about making sense of the future, the reality is our future includes the end of our lives. And now last week it was a boy and his goldfish, and that is what it is. When we start putting it more in very real terms of this human life, this body that I have is going to come to an end, and what does that mean, and what do I do with that now as I know that that's coming, I don't know when. For some people that can be really terrifying. I remember very vividly my very first experience with someone in my life who passed away. 1982, I was 10 years old, my grandfather died. Now I need to understand, this is not an emotional story for me because I was very young and I have very little memories of my grandfather, good or bad or otherwise. I just remember this being my first experience with someone that I knew who died. And going to the funeral home, stepping in, and for the first time seeing my grandfather passed away in a casket. That's a shock of reality a little bit for a 10-year-old guy. Doing what I've been instructed I'm supposed to do at those things, approach the casket, doing that. At which point one of my aunts came up next to me and did something very wise. I learned something really powerful here. She said, "It's okay if you touch him," which was kind of odd, but she encouraged me to just go ahead and put my hand on his hand. And again, this is not an emotional story for me, but it was a learning moment, because if I close my eyes, I can go to that spot instantaneously. I know exactly what that smelled like. I know exactly what that felt like, the coldness of that hand, and just having this reality of it as a 10-year-old kid that Grandpa's not there. Like, there is a dramatic change that happened. Now, we talk about that. Like, little kids, it's hard for them to wrap their heads around when people die. What does that really mean, the permanence of that? I think that's very hard for little kids, but my aunt was wise because she gave me that moment to really start to come to grips with that reality. And I share that story. Again, it's not overly emotional for me, but I also know that it is for many of us who have experienced the loss through death in our lives. And we feel that so deeply. Like, there is such a deep, wounding gap that occurs when we are confronted with the reality of the future end of our lives, the lives of the people that we love. Now, we have a tendency, I think, to try to soften the blow, because it's such a powerful, terrible, terrifying thing to try to wrap our heads around, the idea of life coming to an end. We try to soften the blow and we say, well, it's just kind of part of life. It becomes, kind of our philosophy of naturalism. The natural world says
things live and then things die, and then things live and then things die. And we apply that to our lives in an attempt, I really think, to try to soften the awfulness of that reality. Because, as many of us know, it's pretty awful. I'm going to show you a picture, and you'll, for many of you, you'll understand right away the ways in which this kind of philosophy of naturalism kind of gets sold to us. All right? It's the circle of life. Okay? It's the circle of life. And you'll hear people say that death is just a natural part of life, which that in and of itself is a contradiction in terms. Try to wrap our heads around that intellectually doesn't really work that well. Also know, if that was the case, if this kind of philosophy of naturalism was true, we really shouldn't be that upset with Uncle Scar because he really didn't do anything wrong. It's survival of the fittest. He's just smarter than Mufasa. And so we should actually celebrate him because he is now king of the jungle or whatever. But this is the way we kind of deal with this. We take this tremendously painful thing, the one thing that most of us, all of us are trying to avoid, and we're doing everything in our power to try to just hold off, which, by the way, through all the science and technology, and people are really trying to get us to live as long as possible, it's still not working, right? That, like, death is the one thing that we can't seem to conquer, and so we try to deal with it. We create philosophies and worldviews in an attempt to kind of soften that blow and make it a part of this natural thing. I would say this: while death is a reality, death is not natural. Let me say that again. While death is reality, death is not natural. If death was natural, we wouldn't have such a hard time dealing with it when it happens. It would just be like, oh, that's just kind of part of the deal. You think after a while, if it was natural, we'd just kind of, I don't know, evolve the emotions out of it or something. I don't know. We would just be able to kind of deal with it better. But the reality is, from the little boy and the goldfish on, there is something very, very wrong when we deal with the issue of physical death. It is, while reality, it is not natural. It is not the way God intended it to be. So then how do we approach it as people operating with a Christian worldview who say, okay, it's reality, it's going to happen, well then what do I do with it? How do I approach it? What does Jesus have to say about it? And what does Jesus do about it? And the real question is, okay, it may not be natural, but is it permanent? And I think when we lose someone through death, it feels very permanent. But is it permanent? And that's what we want to get to today. C.S. Lewis, who I just always want to go back to, made an amazing statement. He said, Christianity, and in this case, I'm going to put the resurrection of the dead, because here's the thing, and I try to teach my students this, that if people ask them, what is Christianity, I want them to answer, well, Christianity is just believing that dead people come back to life, which is completely true. It's also a great way to get people talking, because they don't expect you to answer in that way. I mean, imagine that. Hey, what's Christianity about? Oh, we believe that dead people come back to life at our church. That would make fascinating conversations. Fascinating conversations. So C.S. Lewis's Christianity, which I would say resurrection of the dead, because that is it, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Resurrection of the dead, if false, is of no importance. Meaning, if Christianity is not true, if there is no resurrection of the dead, no big deal. Then we'll all just kind of pass away and whatever happens, happens. However, if it is true, it is of infinite importance. So I would make this claim. In a couple of weeks, we're going to celebrate the two greatest events in human history. The death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. Now some people say, wait a minute, those are the two greatest events according to a Christian. No. If they're not true, it doesn't matter. But if they are true, they're the two greatest events in all of human history for everybody, regardless of your position on them. Christianity, if false, is of no importance, but if true, it's of infinite importance. Because when we talk Christianity, we were talking the idea that dead people come back to life. And when we start talking about making sense of the future, that's where we want to talk. So here's a question. Since apologetics is about being reasonable and intellectual, is it reasonable to believe that dead people can come back to life? Because the reality is, in 1982, Grandpa Norris passed away, and I haven't seen him since. Is it reasonable to believe that dead people can come back to life? Now, several weeks ago, we talked about, is it reasonable to believe in God? And we discovered that, yes, it is. Because here's the deal. If we can accept the evidence that there really is a transcendent, all-powerful God who created the universe, who brought the universe into existence by simply going, let there be, we can then certainly believe that miracles can happen, and a resurrection of the dead is an absolute miracle, something that exists outside of the laws of nature, something beyond the laws of this reality. If there is a God that exists outside of that, then intellectually, if we can believe that, then we have to be able to intellectually say, then yes, it is possible for dead people to come back to life. Because that God is so powerful, so transcendent over this realm, the creator of this realm, and yet exists outside of this realm, that he could raise someone from the dead quite easily, because he's that powerful. So just from a base intellectual standpoint, the resurrection of the dead is a reasonable proposition. It's not outside of the realm of impossibility. Okay, but did it really happen? Us Christians say that it did. That there's this guy that claimed to be God, and he died, and then a couple days later, he was alive again, fully restored, showing himself to his disciples who hailed him as their Christ, their conqueror of death. And in him they have given their hope, and now 2,000 years later, we are proclaiming this same resurrected Jesus. Yeah, okay, so intellectually we can say it's a possibility, but did that really happen? That event that we focus on, the hinge point of all of human reality, did that really happen? So let's take a look at some of the evidence. But before we do that, let's take a look at some of the evidence against it. Arguments against resurrection. So when we proclaim that dead people come back to life, because that's what we do, what's the arguments against it? Well, there's several that people can kind of come at it. Well, we don't see it. None of you know anybody who have passed away and has come back from the dead. Now, granted, there are those stories out there of, kind of near-death experiences. You can find books and movies and maybe even a story or two of somebody who, they died on the hospital table and they saw the tunnel and the light and all that kind of stuff and then found themselves back. But the reality is we don't really see it. It's not something that we see on an everyday basis. People just don't come back from the dead. We're scientific people. We look for the evidence. We don't see it, so it doesn't happen. Here's the deal. We don't see dinosaurs either, but we don't argue that they never existed. So what do? We look at the evidence. There is leftover evidence of their existence, which leads us to believe that they really are. They had existed at some point. We can apply the same rationale to the resurrection of the dead, by the way. We don't necessarily see it, but is there evidence that maybe points to the possibility that this thing really happened? Okay. Another argument against the resurrection. Your whole story is not even true. Jesus never existed. And some people will say that. They will say, Jesus is an invention. He is a myth created over time by some people. For whatever reason, Jesus was not a real person. He's a real person. There is so much historical evidence to the existence of Jesus of Nazareth outside of just the Bible that to refute that he existed, whether you believe him to be God or not, is kind of ridiculous. You look at ancient historian Josephus is a great example of that. If you don't know, that great Jewish historian gives us some pretty good outside, extra biblical support that, yeah, Jesus really existed. Okay. Some other arguments against the resurrection that we might hear that are a little bit more popular. Maybe Jesus didn't really die. So let's set the stage. This guy gets crucified, and then he passes out. It's pretty painful. Lost a lot of blood, lost a lot of fluids. He just kind of goes unconscious. We're talking 1st century AD. This is a pre-scientific world. They don't have things to kind of check his vital signs. He looks like he's dead. Can't get a pulse. And Doesn't seem to be breathing. For all appearances, he seems to be dead.
Was he on the side?
Well, yeah, but people have survived some other injuries. That's a good one, by the way. So let's go ahead and take him off the cross, stick him in the tomb. But he's still alive. We just thought he was dead. And after a couple of days of resting in that cool tomb, he feels better suddenly. He wakes up, comes crawling out of the tomb, probably dragging himself out of the tomb, and then appears to his disciples who for the past almost 3 days thought that he was dead. But sure enough, he's here. He has conquered death and starts telling people that Jesus is not dead, but he is alive. And it's really just a big misunderstanding. Some people will go down that route. There are amazing holes in that theory. Talk to Mr. Halverson. He's got a couple of them already purple. There's a lot of holes in the theory that Jesus didn't actually die. But it's one that gets thrown out there. Or this one. Maybe his disciples just lied. I mean, they've invested the past 3 years following this guy as their Messiah. Now they're kind of eating crow a little bit because now he's dead. They look like fools. So let's just go ahead and start telling people that he's alive to kind of save face a little bit. And so they're just liars. That seems like certainly more reasonable than the guy who actually came back from the dead. Okay, there's arguments against the resurrection. So let's look at the evidence for the resurrection, kind of pick on some of those a little bit, and we come to the conclusion pretty quickly today that it's pretty reasonable to consider the possibility that Jesus, by golly, actually came back from the dead. Here's one. Eyewitness testimony. Now, it seems a little self-serving to use the Bible as source material, but I think from a historical standpoint, we can actually do this okay, to go this route. There's eyewitness testimony. In Acts chapter 2, you have this amazing speech given by the Apostle Peter. And he stands up and he says, God has raised this Jesus to life. He's preaching to a large crowd of people. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Acts chapter 2. So what we have is a written record in the book of Acts that people actually saw Jesus alive after he was dead. Like actually saw him. Now, this is significant because it's not just Peter going, I am a witness to the resurrection. We are witnesses of it. If you look through the biblical narrative, you have in all 4 Gospels plus the book of Acts, 40 days worth of resurrection appearances. Jesus just keeps showing up to people. And sometimes it's just one person, or sometimes it's all the apostles, or some women, or a couple of people walking down a road, or, as we're going to see in 1 Corinthians in a little bit, 500 people at one time. He kept showing up to people. There were many witnesses who had seen Jesus alive after he was dead. And Paul makes that proclamation. In the midst of all of this, he says, listen, he's alive. We saw something. You saw something. It's not I saw something, but we were witnesses of this fact. That's a fascinating little piece. The second piece of evidence for the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus is a very early confession of the Christian church. And what I mean by that is we actually have written documentation that people believed, not just the resurrection, but believed that they had seen a resurrected man within a very small window when it actually happened. If the first written record of Jesus' resurrection wasn't written down until about 200 AD, we could go, yeah, that's probably not accurate. But what we have is this amazing document of 1 Corinthians, where Paul, and I'm sorry if it's kind of small, he lays out this confession of faith. And he says, what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, some of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. What's fascinating about 1 Corinthians is that it was written before the Gospels were written. So when people say, well, the Gospels, we can kind of question, the earliest Gospel is Mark. You know, we can kind of question some of that in there. We can say, yeah, but we have 1 Corinthians. That's even earlier than the Gospel of Mark. Now, we have to look at some of the language that Paul uses here. He says, for what I received, I passed on to you. So Paul is writing this to the Corinthians, and it's, I don't know, let's be safe, 62 AD. He says, what I received, I'm now passing on to you in this letter at 62 AD. But he's saying what I received, which means Paul knew about the resurrection from people who saw it before he's writing the letter. Paul became a Christian probably, I don't know, 50-something, maybe 10 years before he actually wrote this letter. And so he had experienced the resurrected Jesus around 50-something AD. But then he's also saying, what I received means the stuff that he's writing about, other people already knew and believed before he had learned it. So we can actually put this whole big, long confession earlier than 52 AD when Paul gets it, almost to the very point of when this event happened. So we are talking about a creed confession of what people believed being expressed within a very small amount of time when this event actually happened. So what this basically means is that the very first Christians were confessing resurrection of the dead. From the get-go, at ground zero. Resurrection was not some kind of myth that developed over time. But it happened in that moment. How is that possible? Because they had seen something to convince them that Jesus, who had died, had come back to life. And we have this early written record that points to the historical reality of an event. This is astounding early evidence. When you compare it to other written record of any other historical event, to have a document written this early is huge. Here's the third one. This is the one that really sets it for me. We have transformed lives. Let's think about these followers of Jesus for a second. Thursday night, Maundy Thursday, Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. The people come and arrest him. Fight breaks out. Jesus is dragged off. Where did the disciples go? They're out of there, baby. They're hiding. They're terrified. Why? Because they don't want what's about to happen to Jesus to happen to them. And so for the next almost 3 days, they're locked up in some room. Every little creak, they're freaking out because they think the soldiers are going to come for them. Out of all of the disciples, only one of them is brave enough to go to the foot of the cross, and that's the Apostle John. The rest of them, there's no record of them going and seeing Jesus in his final moments. They're hiding in some room somewhere. Then what in the world happens that 3 days later, they're standing in the temple courts in the presence of the same people that had Jesus arrested and crucified, proclaiming his resurrection? How does a transformation like that happen? Because those guys saw something. They saw something that gave them a boldness that didn't exist 48 hours before them. That's huge. The Apostle Paul. We know the story of the Apostle Paul. Here's this zealot. Jew of Jews. Hated Christianity. Despised it. It was an abomination against the faith of the Jews. And he actively persecuted Christians. Sought them out. Gave his affirmation as they're stoning Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Traveling up to Damascus in a hope to arrest more Christians. He wanted to stamp this thing out. And then, like a flip of a switch, he becomes the mouthpiece of the gospel for almost an entire empire. How is that possible? Why would that happen? Because he saw something. It wasn't just a belief. It was a physical thing that he witnessed and experienced that radically reset his compass and changed his life dramatically. James, the brother of Jesus, from the evidence in the Gospels, he didn't seem to believe that his brother was the Messiah. And yet, we find him being the leader of the church in Jerusalem. How is that possible? Because he saw something. Something happened. There is evidence that points to a historical event, which is the resurrection of Jesus. Dead people come back to life. What is amazing about this other than the sheer fact of a historical event is that what Jesus does, he offers that to us. And that becomes transforming. Those apostles no longer were afraid for their lives because they have a God who is resurrected from the dead. What do they have to fear? What can you possibly do to me that would make it so that I would not want to proclaim the truth of who Jesus was? I saw a man die and come back from the dead as affirmation of his divinity. And he has promised the same to me. So do what you want with me. You look at the lives of the apostles as they went out and followed that great commission and preached the gospel. Of the 10 remaining apostles, 11 remaining apostles, 10 of them died in terrible, terrible ways, if we believe some of those pieces of church history. Terrible ways. Why? Because they proclaimed the resurrection of the dead. They were transformed lives. Some people will die for a lie if they don't know it's a lie. But those apostles would have known. As soon as they brought those nails out to stick them into my hands, because I've been proclaiming the resurrection, and I knew all along that me and my other apostles were faking it, I'd be giving it up. Oh, we were just kidding. That didn't really happen. These guys died because they had seen something that changed the course of their lives. And that thing is the resurrection of the dead. So when we look at that core verse of apologetics, we give an answer for the hope that we have. And someone asks you, why do you have the hope that you have? We can talk about a lot of things, but the single most important thing that we have is resurrection. The one thing that we cannot solve is our death. And yet we have a God who has solved that for us. And we have evidence for that. And on that we hang our hope. In Jesus' name.
Amen.